You must stay at home. Stay at home.
Hello, and welcome to Lockdown, hosted by Steve Bomford with Mike Davis-Marks. Our armed forces operate in challenging environments. Week by week, we'll explore what we can learn from their experiences.
Hi, Steve. You always say that you desperately try and find someone that I haven't met before, and you think you found someone in your next interviewer. Well, actually, I think I do know him. It's Toby Harnden, isn't it?
I'm about to eat my own words here again. Yes, I was delighted. I thought, excellent, someone in the Royal Navy that you didn't know. And then he made the fatal mistake of mentioning his involvement or being in the Navy at the time that Turbs, HMS Turbulent, was in refit. And of course, I wonder who was the skipper at the time.
Well, I wonder too, but it would be interesting listening to his interview anyway.
It will be. So did they give you a nice new refit? Did they do your bedroom or whatever it is you have on a submarine?
Steve, after all this time, you still call it a bedroom. It's a cabin. And I was the captain, or not skipper, but we'll let that pass. We'll get some naval jargon into you somehow.
I'm very much of the Jules Verne school of submarines. Voyage to the bottom of the sea, you have portholes, you can see all the fish swimming by. That's my imagination for you.
We haven't built a submarine capable of going 20,000 leagues under the sea yet, though.
No, it's probably for the best. But anyway, shall we have a listen to what Toby's got to say?
If our listeners haven't given up by now, let's do that.
How could they? Anyway, let's listen to Toby. Toby, thank you ever so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Sure, good to be with you, Steve.
So you came to me by a slightly different route than everybody else, because normally Mike has squirreled them out of the Royal Navy. But I have spoken to people that you've served with.
That's right. So, I was looking at my Apple podcasts and I noticed Craig Jones, who I served with in HMS Cornwall in 1992, and Alistair Halliday, who I served with in HMS Manchester, I believe, in, 1986. So it was great to listen to old shipmates.
So you're up against it there, because they were a couple of good storytellers, those two, I think, because you probably know them better than I do. So
yeah,
I'm going to ask you to tell me a story about your time in the Navy, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I joined the Navy in 1985. And actually, when I sort of signed up for the podcast, it got me sort of looking in the drawers and stuff. And I found my first pay statement, £13.22 a day. I was on as a midshipman. And I remember it was pretty, at the start was pretty miserable. I turned 19 on the first day we were in routine. I was in Hawk Division at Britannia Royal Naval College. And because of some quirk of allocating duties, and my name's Harnden, so I'm not alphabetically at the top, but I think because I was a university cadet, so I joined, to do basically a year before going to university. I was at the top of these lists. And so it was the first day in routine, which is pretty miserable anyway, because you're getting up really early and being shouted at and all the rest of it. I was also duty midshipman for Hawk Division. And I was the class leader for the joint Hawk Division and Cunningham Division class that I was in. And I realized, but of course, wasn't the thing to do to sort of put your hand up and say it, that the two duties of class leader and duty midshipman were incompatible, that you couldn't do the two things. And so I got shouted at even more than anybody else and felt quite sorry for myself. And it was funny because I was talking to my son the other day, who's 13, and was talking about joining the military at some point. And he said, Dad, I think joining the military is a wake-up call for life. I don't know where he got that from, but he was exactly right. So it was a bit of a wake up for me. My mum had ironed all my stuff, and suddenly I had to iron them in the in precise squares for the drawers and all that. But I have to tell you, it was good preparation for university, because once you've spent a year in basic training and on Dartmouth training ship and all that kind of stuff, university is a lot more fun because you can do whatever the hell you want. So you can just forget all that discipline. But it was a kind of an interesting way of joining the Navy, because I did this basic training, and then I had a place at Oxford to study history, which I went off and did. But I was a serving officer. I was a midshipman and then an acting sub-lieutenant while I was a student. And so I would, go off to do sometimes Navy courses, and my ship, because I grew up in Manchester, so my affiliated ship was HMS Manchester, where Al Harday was one of the watchkeeping officers, and I joined a ship in Hong Kong, and we sailed all around Australia, and I flew back from Sydney, I think, to go back to university for my second year. So it was kind of these straddling these two worlds. And so I joined as a seaman officer, but for some reason I decided that I wanted to be a naval barrister. And then I was a clerk of the court at various courts martial, and saw that, it was a lot of, this sailor stuck glass in this other sailor's face. This sailor was drunk. This officer, didn't keep the books correctly. And I thought, well, maybe that's not the thing to do.
Wasn't quite as glamorous as you'd anticipated.
Right. It didn't, I don't know. There weren't the Perry Mason moments, perhaps, that I'd anticipated. And anyway, to become a naval barrister, I had to transfer to what was then the Supply and Secretariat branch, away from the Seaman branch. And if I'd been a barrister, I think my return of service, which took me to age 28 anyway, would have taken me into my mid-30s. So I rather kind of sort of painted myself into a corner with that. But, I served in HMS Cornwall. We went around the West Indies. I served in HMS Edinburgh after university. Prince Andrew was in the wardroom. And I remember realizing how the system worked when we were leaving, I think, Adelaide. And Prince Andrew was, he'd been a pilot, and he was a junior watchkeeper. I think he was the most junior lieutenant on board. And Fergie, Sarah Ferguson, or her, or whatever we're supposed to call her now, I never know. I mean, has she lost her HRH now?
Well, she's probably going to. I don't know.
They got divorced, and then anyway, who knows? But Fergie, and we would call her Fergie, and she was pretty good fun. She was following us around Australia. She didn't go to sea with us, but sort of port to port. And I faintly remember Prince Andrew got a lot of flack for that, or the two of them got a lot of flack because I think it left a child at home. And so we were leaving Adelaide, and Fergie was on the jetty, and Prince Andrew was the quarterdeck officer. And one of the ropes parted, a wire rope parted, which is basically like kind of like a guillotine, sort of 30-foot guillotine, sort of, being flung across the jetty. And, obviously didn't kill Fergie, because, we'd remember that day now if it had. But it would cut anybody in half.
Wow.
So it was extremely dangerous. And I was on the bridge, and the Captain Alistair Ross, I think, and he was, "Get me the quarterdeck officer." And then you could just see the wheels turning in his head, that the quarterdeck officer is Lieutenant His Royal Highness the Prince Andrew. And so, but it took a few minutes for H, we'd call him H. He wanted us to call, well, in fact, he wanted us to call him Sir, but he was a lieutenant, we were sub-lieutenants. So we had a little meeting and decided, we're calling him H. We're not calling him Sir, because we don't call any of the other lieutenants Sir. And by the time H got to the bridge, the captain was, "Prince Andrew, let's talk about the routines for letting go the ropes, when we leave port." And I remember there's this kind of hilarious moment where everybody knew what was going on. Obviously, it'd been any other lieutenant, it would have been a bit of a different conversation. Mm-hmm. But it was fascinating being on board a ship with a member of the royal family, and it meant we got a lot of attention. We got how shall I put this? Higher class of guests at the cocktail parties. Often, it attracted young ladies who were happy to drink cocktails with us on the flight deck, and it was a lot of fun. Going around Australia, completing my training. I think we went back by Diego Garcia and Karachi when half the ship didn't even go ashore in Karachi, but I thought it was amazing. And, you know, I did various other jobs. I tried very hard to get involved in the Gulf War. I did the opposite of draft dodging. I wrote to the appointer and said, I can be spared, send me. And my boss, Jim Hopkins, a lieutenant commander who was an special duties, you know, ex-writer, was not very pleased with me because he was like, Toby, if, you know, if you're pulled out of this job, then the job will be gapped and it will be left empty and I'll have to do twice the work. So, so he was nice about it. But anyway, I didn't get sent to the Gulf and they managed to win the Gulf War without me. And I also remember Jim saying to me, Toby, there'll be plenty of chances for medals. And I remember thinking, no, there won't. And sure enough, you know, after nearly 10 years service, I left the Navy without a single medal on my chest. And towards the end, I mean, I was flag lieutenant to the Second Sea Lord, which, you know, was bag carrying, doing his diary, accompanying him on visits. And it was interesting. The first Second Sea Lord I worked for, Admiral Mike Livesey, was a wonderful guy. And I think had been, you know, he'd been flying all the way through and was sort of headed for First Sea Lord, didn't quite make it for whatever reason. I think Jock Slater was his big rival, and he was a joy to work for. He was sort of on top of everything. And then the second Sea Lord we worked for was a very different sort of character, Admiral Mike Layard, who had been a very slow promotion all the way through, and I think had surprised everybody, not least himself, by reaching that rank. And so we had a lot more work to do. And I remember one, you know, I mean, probably the closest I ever got to court-martial was with Admiral Layard, the Ministry of Defense main building. And in the office, we had a problem because every slot was designed for 30 minutes. And every captain, for instance, that retired would call on Second Sea Lord as a farewell call. And it was a very busy office, very busy schedule. Admiral Livesey was sort of like a wizard with the paperwork. He would just like rip through it. And, you know, he just wanted more. He was sort of voracious. And when he had a caller, so say a captain who was leaving the Navy, you know, would have some of those every week. And Admiral Livesey would take, you know, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes if you knew him well. And then he'd be, you know, on with his work. And we got used to this. And Admiral Layard came and we realized that, you know, these calls would take, at 30 minutes, the guy would still be in there. And then so I'd have to go in, sir, you know, we've got another appointment. And you know, it was a real problem for the diary. And so I'd have to go in and, you know, and anyway, everything would take like 40, 45 minutes, sometimes longer. And then he started, one day, a friend came, friend of his, I forget who it was. And he suddenly popped his head out of the office and said, "Oh, Toby, you know, it'd be lovely if we could have some wine and some white wine." And I was like, "What? You know, I mean, this is in the morning, I think." And so I was like, "Okay, you know, he's an admiral and I'm a lieutenant." So I ran down the corridor to the other offices because we had the control of the Navy's office, the chief of fleet support, all these other 4-stars, and Wiggy Bennett was the assistant or an SD writer, I think. Anyway, I ran into his office. He worked for I think chief of fleet support, and said like, "Wiggy, if you got any wine?" And he's like, "Yeah, you got any white wine?" He said, "Yeah, I've got a bottle." And he said, "It's not cold. It's not in the fridge." I said, Don't worry. So I grabbed this bottle of wine, you know, found a corkscrew, uncorked it, found like a silver like platter that was in the outer office, you know, walked into Admiral Layard's office with this wine and had a couple of glasses on the silver platter. You know, and I'd been running around like a maniac, but obviously, you know, you walk in all serene, like, you know, everything's under control. Gave him the wine. "Oh, thank you. And then later in the day, Admiral Layard said to me, "Toby, are you interested in wine?" And I said, "Well, you know, I like drinking it, and you know, I suppose I am quite interested." And I was thinking maybe there's a wine event coming up, and he wants me to accompany him or something. And I said, "You know, but it's not my specialist thing." And he says, "Yes, I thought not, because, white wine should be served chilled. And I just looked at him and I thought, there's nothing I can say that can usefully contribute to the furtherance of my career at this point. So I just turned around and walked out of the office. So, it was interesting being in the Ministry of Defence, working for a member of the Navy board. And I saw everything. I staffed promotion reports, honours and awards. I mean, this was a time when we had women had just, I'm trying to think, this was, so women had just gone to sea. So Wrens at sea was a big issue. There was discussion about changing, the ban on gays in the military, all those things in the personnel office. But I decided, cut my losses, it was great as a young officer for me that it was fantastic being on board ships. It was fantastic being able to know everybody on board a frigate or destroyer, like 250 people from, the most junior sailor to the captain, and being able to sort of know them all and talk to them all and work with all of them. But I sort of felt that, I'd had some really good jobs. I spent a month on exchange with the Norwegian Navy at one point when we were herding reindeer from from their winter pastures from their summer pastures to their winter pastures.
Forgive me, how does a Navy get involved in herding reindeer? They're not aquatic animals, are they?
I don't know. That's what the Norwegian Navy did. And actually, it's another thing I dug out. There was a Smiles cartoon in Navy News from December 1987. It's of Santa on a sleigh with a reindeer, and these reindeers knocking over these young sub-lieutenants. Subs on exchange play Santa. And it was a Smiles cartoon with Santa shouting at us, or Father Christmas, I guess, is the more British term. Ruddy makey learnees. So, that was fun. So I'd had a lot of fun. I think I'd learned a lot. I think it had really given me a sense. Yeah, the Navy gives you a sort of sense of, I think, humility in a way. And as I say, this sort of ability to get on with people at all levels. But I felt that the more senior I got, the more I'd have to toe the line, and the more I'd have to do things I didn't want to do. I realized I had enough self-knowledge to know that I had a low boredom threshold. And the other bigger picture thing was, I joined just after the Falklands. And, as I mentioned, I wasn't able to get involved in the Gulf War, and the Cold War was over. And so my naval career was going to lots of nice places. Went to Australia twice, joined ships in Hong Kong, went all around the Caribbean with the West Indies Guard ship, all around Europe. It was fantastic, but it felt like, what's the point here? Because the Cold War had ended, but we were still working on guarding the northern flank of NATO and all that. And I had this, I'm fourth generation military. My father was in the Navy. His father was in the army in World War II and before and afterwards as well. And so I had this sort of thirst for adventure, I guess. And I felt that journalism would offer more of it at that time than the Navy. And that is how it turned out.
So that sounds like a seamless link, if I'm not. It's like a well-rehearsed seamless link. I think you've got fed up with being a wine waiter. I mean, that's probably the real reason. You just don't want to say it. And then,
that was certainly part of it.
Well, I can understand that. And I don't know much about wine either, apart from white wine should be chilled. So what happened next, Toby? You obviously did a history degree, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
I guess that stood you in good stead. So what happened next? How did you get into journalism? Can I just say as well that I know many of our listeners are going to be interested in this story as well. So if you've got any top tips, share them.
Well, so I didn't have... So, yes, my background was in writing. And, at the careers office in school, I remember looking at like becoming a journalist. It's always something that was I was interested in. And so I guess my advice was, and it must have been given to me, I can't remember who, was just to write things, quite obvious. But, there's there's a ton of people who want to enter journalism who say, oh, well, I'm interested in writing. And then you say, well, what have you written? Well, I did some essays at school. But I did reviews, but like I did book reviews for the Naval Review. There was a magazine called Command magazine at the time, which was run by a guy called Hugh McManus, who was a Falklands veteran. And I rode on an ancient, recreated ancient trireme Greek rowing ship. I wrote about that. Because I was in Second Sea Lord's office, there was a Second Sea Lord called Admiral Richard Fitch, who around about, I think, 93, very sadly, he was a Lloyd's name who'd lost a ton of money and killed himself. And our office was asked to write an obituary. And so I was interested in journalism at this point. So obviously I volunteered for that job. And it ended up with, a big obituary with a byline, because the Independent had bylines, with my name on it in a national newspaper. So that's my first national newspaper clipping. And then I said to them, well, can I do more obituaries of admirals? So they said yes. So I'd write obituaries of admirals, and the Second Sea Lord's office sort of seemed to be okay with it, and they didn't tell me not to anyway. And so I did that. And then because I'd been based at HMS Cochrane in Rosyth, I had a flat in Leith in Edinburgh. So that's where I'd go to sort of, in the holidays and stuff. And there was a friend from Oxford who, it was a pretty tenuous connection, but he worked for the Scotsman and he'd done theatre reviews for them. And so I got a job in the summers, while I was still in the Navy, writing theatre reviews at the Edinburgh Fringe. And so that gave me this bug of just writing stuff, and then it gets printed. And because if I wrote a glowing review, sometimes it would be up on a sort of a billboard in a couple of days' time with my name and everything. I also wrote, again, looking back, it's sort of surprising as a serving naval officer, but I used to write letters to the Independent, sort of pompous letters, sort of opining on things, and they would get printed as well. I guess I didn't use my rank. So I had enough sort of clippings. And so then when I'd sort of bitten the bullet and I was in the process of leaving, and you have to give in your notice. And at that point, it was about a year. You had to serve about a year, sort of kicking your heels. And I was sort of sent in exile to Plymouth, to HMS Turbulent, to submarine in refit. But I remember there was a guy, a fantastic guy who's now dead, but Gordon Ducker, who was the night news editor at the Daily Express. And he was also an RAF reservist, like public affairs guy. And I remember talking to him. I said, how do I break into national newspapers? Because, I'm going to be a little bit older. I'm nervous about, going to a regional paper and then being this sort of old guy coming to Fleet Street. And he said, well, the best way to break onto Fleet Street is to go to one of the diaries, like the Times diary, or the Telegraph diary was then called Peterborough. And he said, you were in the Navy. Max Hastings is the editor. He loves the services. So why don't you try the Telegraph? So that's what I did. And that was my foot in the door. I just wrote a letter to Quentin Letts, who's still around, who's a Peterborough editor. And here's a bit of advice: never offer to work for nothing. because I thought, well, I'll have to pay me, but I'll just, show that I'm really keen by offering to work for nothing. And Quentin was like, yeah, sure. Thanks very much. Come in.
Yeah.
So I worked for nothing for a while, although I got paid if I came up with a story, which was an encouragement to come up with stories. But my basic shift rate was 0. But that was my foot in the door. And I remember as soon as Quentin had written back to me, I got the letter and he said, yes, if you'd like to make an appointment with my secretary, this is old days, obviously pre-internet and everything. I thought, yeah, that's it. I'm there. My foot's in the door. I'll never take it out, and it's fine. And of course, looking back, lots of people get to that stage and just fall by the wayside, but I was just convinced that was it. And I never did take my foot out of the door. And so, from there, I got a trial on news. Another bit of advice is, so I had my trial on news. It'd gone well. I worked for a month on news, and then I was doing shifts. And at that point, I left the Navy, and I'd worked out that I'd, slightly sort of fudged it on the old mortgage documents. because I used my naval salary, didn't tell them I was about to leave. So I bought this flat in Camberwell in London.
Was that the piece of advice?
No, this is
the mortgage advice.
Well, yeah. That's how the financial crash came about, isn't it?
It's your fault.
Well, I guess the piece of advice is I worked it out that I bought a 3-bedroom flat. I thought, right, I can rent out 2 rooms, which will cover the mortgage, so I can earn nothing. If I'd stuck to the Quentin Letts formula, that's what I would have been doing. But by this point, I was on getting shifts. But it gave me the sort of wiggle room to continue essentially trying out for the Telegraph. And I remember it was pretty nerve-wracking. I mean, I was down to, a couple of shifts a week. So, I don't know, like £200 a week or something. But that's what you had to do. You had to be available, and you had to be persistent. And then shortly after that, I got a contract. And the bit of advice is never take no for an answer, because no is often certainly in journalism is like the opening bit. No, you can't have a visa. No, you can't do this. No, so I'd been told that I got a contract, a 2-month contract, and had this letter from Max Hastings saying, contract. And then it all sort of went quiet, and I was a bit sort of nervous about it, and I was still doing shifts. And then I got another letter from Max Hastings, which I know wasn't written by him, because it gave advice he would never give, which is basically, I'm terribly sorry, but I didn't realize that the financial situation of the paper is not as great as I thought, and therefore we don't have the money to give you a contract. My advice would be go and work on a regional newspaper. And I know Max would never believe that you should do that, because he never did that, unless you count the Evening Standard as a regional paper. And so I remember talking to a friend who was also sort of a rival, but we were both doing shifts on the Telegraph. And I said to her, so what do you think I should do? She was like, I don't know, nothing. So I just said, okay, I'm just going to do nothing. I'm just going to pretend I never got that letter and keep on doing shifts. And then sure enough, a few weeks later, I don't know, I'd done some story or whatever, and they said, you can have a contract. So if I'd followed that advice, I would have gone to work for the Yorkshire Post or something, and probably spent 2 or 3 years, outside London, and probably would never have, good chance I probably would never have got a job on Telegraph. So yeah, I completely ignore that piece of advice.
I'm noticing a theme here. Is there not taking advice, maybe not wanting to go too far up the ladder in the Navy, doing what they're told?
I guess so. I mean, yeah. I mean, I guess I have tended in life, for good and for bad, to sort of push the envelope. Mm-hmm. I don't love authority, and obviously, I mean, as a journalist, generally speaking, you're sort of against authority. You're trying to find out things you shouldn't know, print things people don't want you to print, upset people, and you're sort of on the side of the everyman or every person, the reader, very much, I think. And so I do think, the best way to get me to do something is say, you won't be able to do that. That's impossible. It just can't be done. And as soon as I hear that, I start to feel sort of this surge of, I don't know, adrenaline or something like, okay, I'm going to do that. I can do that. So I guess there is a bit of a theme in this. Yeah.
Bit of tenacity going on there, I think.
Yeah. Bloody-mindedness.
Oh, it's being polite. Come on.
Yeah. I don't know.
So you've got your boot in the door. You haven't taken it out of the Telegraph. What was journalism like then? Because this is pre-internet, am I right? Or very early internet. It must have been a very, very different world.
It was. I mean, it was fantastic. I mean, so you now kind of end up sounding like an old fart, because you just think, that was not like it was. And I remember people at the time saying, it's not like it was. But, and obviously, that letter from Max Hastings indicated, money was a thing. I mean, I think one time actually going to the tsunami was at the end of 2004. I was on holiday in Norway, and I had to get to Thailand very quickly, and the only seat available was business class. that was the only time in my journalism career I flew business class. So, it was economy. It was always, can you get a cheap, and increasingly, can you get a budget flight? Can you go from Luton, and on EasyJet, via Kiev or whatever it is. And but in 1994, even at the time, it perhaps felt like a little bit of an end of an era, but it was still in that old era. It was all print. We had a huge circulation of more than 1 million. I mean, getting an article in the Daily Telegraph, there was huge sort of pressure. It sort of meant a lot. I mean, I remember, my big break was going to Northern Ireland. I got sent to Northern Ireland in 96, and I was there from 96 to 99. I remember at the end of that thinking, well, I think I've done a pretty good job. The editor says I've done a good job, but there must be readers out there who are really interested in Northern Ireland and read the paper before I came along, and they can read it afterwards and always read the Northern Ireland stuff. I wonder what they think of it. I have no idea. And now, of course, you have way more an idea than you would want to about what people think all the time on Twitter and newspaper
so
comments.
We were talking about this, weren't we, last week? And I'm quite intrigued to ask you, what is it for good or is it for bad? I mean, how the internet, in some ways you must be terrified to write something, for fear of what nonsense people are going to respond with. How would you say that's affected you, obviously, in journalism?
Well, it's both. I mean, I love the engagement, actually. And I did blogging early on. And, I do Twitter, I do Instagram now. And at first it was great because you had this engagement, you had this feedback, you had these kind of public spaces, but they felt private and intimate where you could bat around ideas. And I still like that. But, newspaper comment sections turned into sewers. Nobody, I don't think people even look at them now. And I think it has led to a new generation of journalists being really scared, and they can't even sometimes state a plain fact for fear of sort of being shouted at on Twitter and social media. And it's extremely sort of unpleasant. And so what I do now is I try and keep very firmly sort of on brand and within kind of line. So I talk hardly at all about, personal life. I don't express opinions generally. I may do something sort of analytical, but in some ways that's good. I mean, who cares what I think about Donald Trump or Boris Johnson for that matter? I mean, it's not interesting. I mean, and I'm not really interested in what some random person thinks about, COVID rules or whatever. And that's not my sort of expertise. My expertise is, military and the CIA and terrorism and Afghanistan and what have you. And so I'll stick to those things. But yeah, in those early days, I mean, the Telegraph was wonderful because it was, it was conservative editorially, but it was straight news. They loved, some of these things have stuck with me, sort of detail, like they had great court reports where they'd have all the lurid detail written in a very sort of straight-faced sort of manner. And I think it was a sort of a paper of record. It didn't take, I remember Quentin Letts actually saying to me at one point, I suggested a story and says, Toby, we don't write about divorces. And so, obviously all that's changed. But yeah, I guess I do look back on those days. The rigor, I had the guy called Brian Silk, who's the night news editor there, who reported all around the world and Africa and Vietnam. And he was sort of the tutor for the junior reporters. And we were, he put the fear of God into us, and he hunted down sort of cliches or journalese, and we had every word had to count. And now, that's another thing. You could, the internet is infinite, so people write way, way, way too much. They write 1,000 words when they can write 250, and so I feel very grateful that I have the discipline of working in those sort of pre-internet days. And as to whether, I mean, the internet's an amazing thing. It's full of incredible information. You can hunt it down. Most people don't. Most people don't go past, the first page of Google News or Wikipedia or whatever. But I think having grown up pre-internet, when sometimes I'd go to bookshops when I wanted to find something out, or I'd look in an encyclopedia. So having done that, I feel that I can use it as a resource, better than many people. And almost everything is there. If you want to find out about a person, how to contact them, what they're interested in, who they know, it's all there. I mean, it's a little bit frightening, but that's a wonderful resource as a journalist and as a writer.
It is. For our younger listeners, an encyclopedia is what people used to use before there was Google, book-shaped thing, I think, Encyclopedia Britannica. But you've talked about social media, and you've been posting lots and lots of photos that relate to your current book. Yeah. Which we also talked about last week, and I was fascinated by these. But before we go on to that, please, can you tell me a little bit about First Casualty, which you rather kindly sent me a copy, or your publisher sent a copy, and I think it's a fantastic read. I don't read a lot, so don't please use this as a 5-star review from Company Makers, because it'll count for nothing.
Okay.
But seriously, I think it's a really good book. So tell me, I mean, the amount of research that must go into a publication like this is just like beyond my comprehension, but obviously this is what you're good at. So tell me a bit about the book, please, Toby.
Yeah, sure. So just for background, it's my third book. So I did a book in 1999, Bandit Country, about the IRA in South Armagh, the IRA in its sort of border heartland. And then I did a book in 2011 called Dead Men Risen, about the Welsh Guards in Helmand. And that kind of grew from the death of a friend of mine, Rupert Thorneloe, who's a lieutenant colonel, battalion commander, who was killed in action in 2009. And then this book, First Casualty, is about the CIA, and the Green Berets and the SBS, but it's at the core. It's Team Alpha, who were the 8 Americans who were the first behind enemy lines after 9/11. So they landed at south of Mazar-e Sharif on October the 17th, 2001, in two Black Hawk helicopters, and they linked up with the warlord Abdul Rashid Dostum, captured Mazar-e Sharif, and then Mike Spann was killed in an Al Qaeda uprising in the prison Kalajangi, an old fort where it was being used to house prisoners, on November the 25th, 2001. And so it's funny, when I look at the 3 books, I feel there is a sort of a commonality there. And I guess what has become my specialism, I think, is gritty, granular detail of the reality of war, set in the broader context of important national events. And obviously 9/11 was a huge event. I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. on that day. So a big sort of event in my life that led to me, doing lots of reporting in Iraq and Afghanistan and all the rest of it. And so I was frustrated I couldn't get to Afghanistan immediately because I was having to cover politics in Washington. But I vividly remember Mike Spann being killed. So he was a CIA paramilitary officer, former Marine Corps officer. And he was killed in Kalajangi on November 25th, 2001. And his wife, Shannon Spann, who was also a CIA officer, gave his eulogy at Arlington Cemetery. And I wrote a couple of news stories from Washington about that. But then the world moved on. Iraq, anthrax was going on. It was just sort of, there was so much happening. But it sort of never left me. And then I was in Iraq as a reporter 2 or 3 years later, and somebody said, have you ever seen the video of that CIA guy running through the fort, after Mike Spann was killed? And I hadn't seen it. I looked at it on YouTube, and it was incredible. It was a guy called David Tyson, who's a CIA case officer, a linguist, not a sort of elite warrior type, former academic. And there happened to be a German film crew in the fort that day, and they captured footage of him running across this courtyard, clutching a Kalashnikov and a pistol, having just shot dozens of Al-Qaeda guys. And then he sort of bursts into this room, into this German TV crew, and they start asking him sort of goofy questions. And you see the 1,000-yard stare and these staring eyes. And I was fascinated by, like, how did he get there? How's he been affected by this? What had he been through? I mean, it was sort of a footage of a guy who'd been through almost unimaginable trauma, who still thought he might be killed, in the next few minutes or few hours. And so, I became very interested in Kalajangi because it seemed like everything was there. So John Walker Lynn, the American Taliban, who's actually Al Qaeda, young Californian, he was there. He was one of the prisoners. The SBS were there. The Green Berets, this warlord from Central Casting, Dostum. There was a big friendly fire incident where the Americans dropped a 20,000-pound JDAM, which is huge, on a friendly position, killed a lot of Afghan allies, turned over a tank, wounded Brits and Americans. AC-130 gunships coming in, F-18s. It just seemed like everything was there in this place. So I was really, really interested in that. And then around 2013, I decided to try and find David Tyson. And this is a little bit related to searching for people on the internet. I mean, David Tyson, pretty common name. But I found a mention of him in some acknowledgements in an academic paper from a professor at the University of Indiana. And so I emailed the professor and he said, thanks for your email, I'll forward it to David. And then, one day the phone rang and it was David Tyson. And so that was kind of the start of it. He was still serving in the CIA, so it was difficult for him to talk. He wasn't allowed to, I presume. But I knew he sort of wanted to tell his story in some way. Although when we actually did it, eventually he says, I don't want it to be my story. I want it to be the broader Team Alpha story and the broader story of the response to 9/11. And so 2019, I got a book contract. Coincidentally, a couple of months later, David contacted me and said, hey, I've retired. I'm ready to talk. And I was like, I'm not very religious, but there must be a God. And so I, spent a lot of time with him. And then I went some people sort of said in reviews and stuff, he was granted access by the CIA. As if the CIA just phoned me up and said, hey, Toby, we've got all these guys. Would you talk to them? It was exactly the opposite of that. I had to, search them out, go from person to person, build up sort of a rapport and a degree of trust with each person, say, could you recommend me to so-and-so? And do you think they'll talk? Well, probably not, but I'll ask them, And so I did all that. And eventually I spoke to all 6 surviving members of Team Alpha. I spoke to there were 8 SBS. One of them was a Navy SEAL who was on an exchange job with them. Steph Bass, I interviewed him. I interviewed members of the SBS team, loads of Green Berets, AC-130 crews, and I just sort of pieced it all together. And it's a really, really heavy lift because everything has to be accurate, and you have contradictory accounts because in battlefield situations, people get tunnel vision. Their memories get distorted because they talk to other people immediately afterwards. And there's a 20-year period. And so you sort of have to navigate all that. But in each book I've done, I've been able to get a lot of sort of documents as well. And in this case, sort of late on, David gave me his diary, like suddenly sort of let me know that, he kept a diary. And
I guess you're not meant to do that in the CIA.
I guess actually, you're not. But anyway, I'm glad he did. I don't think there was classified information in it particularly. It's just sort of, how he felt and what he'd been through. And it was very useful for establishing dates because, I had to do a map and a chronology and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's like putting a jigsaw together when you got a whole load of pieces missing and then pieces from another jigsaw in it. And you have to, but you have to sort of make a picture and you have to sort of make sense of it. So in a way, there's a sort of creative aspect to that. So it's a narrative about people. It starts on 9/11, and it's these eight guys at the center of it, and others on the periphery. And there's a line, a narrative line right the way through it. And so you have to be quite self-disciplined, which I think I wasn't as much in Dead Men Risen, which became a very long book, but with First Casualty, to not go off on too many tangents and try and keep to that kind of core narrative. And you sort of think in your mind of like a kind of a movie script type of thing. where
well, it does feel. I mean, I know obviously you've got all these kind of organisations and characters. It does feel like that. It's very pacey, I would say.
Yeah,
it does feel like. You do feel kind of. I wasn't bored in any way. Thinking it's just
well,
like a list of dates.
Again, this relates to the internet and what have you. People have shorter attention spans. I do too. I start to read a book and then my phone goes ping and I'm looking at things. It's hard, and so you can't do. I mean, unless you're like a huge name, you can't write a book that's sort of 4 inches thick. You have to keep the reader's attention because there's so many other things that are competing for that attention. And so, yes, you have to have background and context. So I had to talk about, what the CIA had done in the 1980s against the Russians, the rise of Al-Qaeda, missions into Afghanistan before 9/11. But what I couldn't do is like, and here's a history lesson for the next 2 chapters, because the reader would just sort of, put the book down and sort of leave the room. And so there's this, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I can't remember who came up with the phrase, but it's very apt, which is, I'm sorry I couldn't write it shorter. I didn't have enough time. And I mean, that's true. I mean, and that goes back to the writing 1,000 words when 250 will do. I mean, I worked very hard at this to kind of shave it down and compress it and make every word counts and to leave stuff out, leave really good anecdotes and, from great people, because it just didn't quite fit. So, I struggle with all that.
So how long does this take, and kind of what impact does it have on you in terms of how you feel about the story? Does that change? So you've discovered something, you've seen a video and think, there must be something here. And then you go on this journey. But it's like you said, it's a creative process. How does that change your perspective? And how long does all this take? Because it sounds to me like an awful long time.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of how long is a piece of string? I mean, you can spend a decade writing a book and people do that. This, it was a long period in sort of germination, but when it came down to it, it was, I was full time. And so it was about a year. The research and the writing was and it was very intensive. And to answer your question, it changes constantly because you have these kind of ideas about these people. And, I guess, David Tyson, I didn't know him at all. I felt he was probably really kind of severe. He's not. He's got an incredible sense of humor. He's really irreverent. And he's a good friend now. And I've really got to know him. And as time goes on, I could talk forever about the interplay between the different personalities on that team because I got to I got to know them, and so it's kind of like this sort of living thing that as the picture becomes clearer and and there were so many also surprises, things even quite late on. There'll suddenly be like somebody will just mention something and be like, what? I didn't know about that. Like later on David said to me, in fact, it was one of the last things I put in the book. He was like, he just mentioned that he'd applied to join the French Foreign Legion when he was 17.
As you do.
Yes, that's right. But it said so much about his sort of wanderlust, and he grew up in, this very sort of modest background in Pennsylvania, but he had this thirst for languages and to get out into the world. And his brother's a plumber who still lives in the house, he grew up in, has never left Pennsylvania and lives with their 94-year-old mother. So something happened, something in the DNA, something that just made David like this. And so that was just a great thing to be able to slip in. And, in a way, the book, it kind of continues to live, because I do lots of, podcasts and presentations, sometimes with other team members from Team Alpha. So we're going to VMI, Virginia Military Institute, which is like a military kind of university in Virginia, with actually Justin Sapp, Green Berets going, and David Tyson is going, Scott Spellmeyer is going. He was on the team. And strange enough, Scott and Justin both went to VMI. And then, you mentioned Instagram. So I realized I had 16,000 photos because, you're always asking people for, images. So, I mean, photos are incredible I mean, obviously they're images that you can look at, and that's interesting, but also in terms of describing scenes and stuff, and it means you can look at the photo and think, oh, that's there, and this is what the tree was like, and that's the bird that was there, and that's the weapon. And so yeah, as you're going along, I learned, you're always asking people, did you send any emails, did you diaries, were there any documents, photos? And so I ended up with 16,000 of these things. And you can have a certain number in the book, and I was really pleased with the photos in the book, actually. But you have to. It's not a picture book. You can't. You can't have like 150 pictures. And so I put them out on Instagram, and they're sort of with little excerpts from the book sometimes, which sort of entices potentially new readers, and also I think for people who are really into it, really, really interested, it gives them a little bit more, and it gets a nice social media conversation going when people sort of make comments and stuff. And yeah, I found, I was told what Justin from the team had told me that the AKMSs, the Kalashnikovs with the folding stock, he told me that they were Romanian made. And then of course, there's a number of people out there who are, spend their whole lives obsessing about Kalashnikovs. And they were like, no, East German made. So for the paperback edition, no, I'll change it out and put it, it's East German. And so it's sort of like an ask the audience sort of fact check. And there's an occasional little thing that I learn. I was thinking, that would have been good for the book. But I had to get it out for the 20th anniversary of 9/11. The Afghanistan exit was coming up, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And at some point you sort of have to push the button. Also, I think if you go on too long, you start forgetting things. So there's a kind of a point where your brain is just sort of saturated. You've been really living this thing and literally dreaming about it. Dreamt about Mike Spann, so you just have to sort of do it. But I do like the fact that it can continue to live in some form with these images and other outlets like podcasts.
Yeah. I mean, I must admit, I found the photos to be fascinating as well, because it really, I read the book, like I said, and I found when you said you had 16,000 of them, oh, crikey, I'm going to be following you on Instagram for quite a while. But they really do help to illustrate, just, in terms of putting names to faces. There's lots of different cultures obviously involved in the Northern Alliance, obviously the United States, the British, so on and so forth. And I think it helps to illustrate all these things as well. So
yeah,
I think you've done a great job. Well done.
Well, thank you very much. I'll take that 5-star review.
You can have 5-star reviews.
Very welcome.
If you, I'll do you a 5-star review. Absolutely, I will, because I did genuinely enjoy the book. So the obvious question is, what's next?
So I spent. So I became a journalist in '94. So I spent 25 years or something as a foreign correspondent mostly, and I ended up covering American politics a lot. Partly for family reasons, kids. I remember thinking I loved war reporting. Iraq, Afghanistan. I was Sunday Telegraph chief foreign correspondent at one point, where I was flying to, felt like a different place every week. Went to Zimbabwe. I was in prison in Zimbabwe for a couple of weeks, which is a whole different story and podcast. Then I ended up just doing yet another American election, and they're fun to do, and I think I could do it quite well. Then you had the whole Trump thing where, I remember fighting with the Sunday Times in 2016 about, like, really, you want me to write another story about Donald Trump? You do realize he's never going to be president, don't you? And so, at a certain point in your career as a journalist, you can try and climb the greasy pole and, return to London and be the foreign editor or whatever. But the passion that I had for writing these books, began to sort of far outweigh the passion I had for the day-to-day journalism. And so I'm going to try and make it work. I did this book sort of full time. I have another proposals with publishers at the moment. I mean, there were 10 years between the first and second book and the second and third. So obviously, if I'm going to try and make a living out of this, I have to have a much better hit rate than that. So
you're going to need to increase the frequency a smidge.
Yes.
I'm no expert,
yeah, exactly.
but I think you're probably going to need to.
Yeah. So, I want to do another non-fiction book, and and I built up a lot of contacts and a degree of trust amongst the CIA, Green Berets, retired military, and so I'm going to kind of stick to that sort of genre. But I'll also I've always been, it's never actually happened, but I've always been very interested in ghostwriting as a completely invisible ghost. So helping someone with their own memoir editing. I'm interested in sort of language and getting it right, and I love the process of books, and so I'll probably do some editing work and stuff on the side, but as much as I can, I'm just going to concentrate on doing non-fiction books and see how that goes.
Brilliant. I look forward to the next one. We will include links to your Instagram and Twitter, and to the book, of course, First Casualty, which will probably be on Amazon, and we're not taking any cash because I don't know how to do any of that, but it will be available. And you've also really kindly agreed to do a talk for us at the end of the month, which will be open for people. So if people want to see more of these photos and you narrate them, and people want to ask you some questions, they can do so. So thank you very much for agreeing to do that as well.
Okay, not at all, Steve. Happy to.
Thank you very much, Toby.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
So that was quite interesting, wasn't it? It's a story and a half, and I'm not talking about your cabin either.
At least you've got the terminology right now, Steve. So we've got a retired naval officer who can write. Now, that's a bit of an oxymoron if I've ever come across one, although I'm sure there are plenty of naval officers that will be going harumph at that particular point. But, a sort of game of two halves, Brian.
Yes, I think it absolutely was. I'm sure there are many people who have served that can write books. I hope so anyway, because we're going to be doing some talks with them.
Yeah, no, I'm only teasing. I mean, actually, not only could he write, but he's made a career, a very fulsome career at it, both as a journalist and now as a non-fiction writer of some repute. So, you said in your interview with him that you received a book and you've been reading through it. Well, one turned up on my bookstep, I presume by the same publisher, about 4 weeks ago, and I've just finished reading it. So it was fantastic.
Well, I did think it would be quite difficult for you to talk about an author's new book if you hadn't read it. Whether you were going to read it upon receipt was my challenge.
Yeah, I coloured it in as well. That was. Why don't we go back to the start, though? Because actually, he talked about joining the Navy in 1985. He was a midshipman, went through Britannia Royal Naval College, as I did all those years ago, and his first monthly wage slip was £13.22. Now, of course, in most naval messes those days, your pay had your mess bill subtracted from it. So it may be that his mess bill actually swallowed up all of his pay bar £13.22. He didn't let that on, but I suspect there might have been a hefty mess bill involved in that final settlement. And he said he was a university cadetship entry, which means that you join the Navy with a place at university already secured, and the Navy basically sponsors you through a university. It's kind of like an officer and apprenticeship. And I did one very similar in 1977. It's a fantastic way of getting a degree and joining the Navy at the same time.
So do they still do that?
They do. It's much reduced. And you know that my time in the Navy ended with me being Director of Naval Recruiting.
Yep.
We're very much trying to reduce the number of graduates, apart from specific entries like engineers, doctors, because actually we want to put our own imprint on them over those 3 years, rather than allow them just to go and read something that may or may not be of use to them.
Well, that wouldn't be very good, would it?
I enjoyed my 3 years in London. It was fantastic. Anyway, we're not talking about me. We're talking about Toby. And he did 10 years, and he had I really liked his attitude. He really wasn't a conformist at all, was he?
No. Does that remind you of anybody? Not didn't want to be told what to do.
Yeah, well, I wasn't as clever as him, or could write as well as him, or had the initiative to leave after 10 years. I stuck it out for 36. But, I mean, actually, he did quite a lot in his 10 years. I mean, we got a lot of, because he was the surface Navy, not the submarine Navy, so they tend to go to more places in the sun. 2 trips to Australia, 1 to the Far East, Hong Kong, the Caribbean as West Indies guard ship. I mean, it wasn't a bad 10 years, was it?
Not at all. But, being in a submarine, you probably don't really want to be telling people where you've been. In fact, who knows? Do the crew actually know?
They generally know whereabouts we are, but not perhaps specifically all the time. But there's no point in keeping it completely secret from them. We're all in it together, so it's quite useful to keep them in the picture. Anyway, so he did his 10 years and discovered at the latter end of that 10 years that actually he quite liked writing, and journalism had always been something that had been at the back of his mind, and he'd studied history at Oxford. He's the only other naval officer is Chris Parry, studied history at Oxford. He can write too. And he used that to start writing obituaries before he left, which I thought was really interesting way of transitioning.
Do you know what? This even came up in our writing workshops, actually, as a way of honing your skills. It seems like quite an unusual way to start your writing career, but Toby kind of vindicated what Dan was saying in the workshops.
Yeah, I do. Obituaries are quite difficult to write because you're obviously a bit like a eulogy at a funeral. You write things that need to be largely positive, but also don't spare, they've got to have some interesting stories and things like that. And they require a lot of research to get right and not hurt sensitive feelings at the time. So it's a skill. I know a few people that can do it really well. It obviously a good segue into his second career, really.
Absolutely. It certainly stood him in good stead.
Yeah, I like the fact that he went to, after that, he went and worked for, was it the Daily Telegraph, on a shift basis. And one of his maxims was never take no for an answer. When they said, we want you to stop working, he ignored it. Nelson did that once at the Battle of Casualty, put a telescope to his blind eye and said, I see no ships. He follows in good company.
So is that the kind of skills I need to be a naval officer?
What, put your telescope to your blind eye?
Yeah.
It worked for Nelson. I'm not sure it works for everybody, to be honest. I wouldn't recommend it.
Or specifically, it doesn't work for you, Steve.
I don't think it works for me either, to be honest. The number of interviews I've had with the telephone directory when we used to have them down the back seat of my trousers. Anyway, but I suppose that slight nonconformism allowed him in his writing to go and ask difficult questions of people that, weren't always willing to give him a truthful answer. So I think actually that's it's a good skill for a journalist to have, an investigative journalist in particular, and also a good skill for when you start writing non-fiction books like the ones I've got in my hand at the moment.
I mean, the research side of this must have been just, well, he said it was a year, but I mean, that's a lot of work, isn't it? Just for the research.
I get the impression from what he was saying that it was not just research, but it was sensitive research, because he was dealing with people about a situation, well, probably 20 years ago now, which was very difficult, largely not spoken about, involved the loss of one of their fellow officers, and probably traumatized them in the making of it.
Absolutely. I guess it's about building trust, isn't it? I mean, that's what you have to do, and then people would be more inclined to share their stories with someone that's empathetic with them.
Well, he certainly seemed to do that, because the way it comes out in the book, particularly one of the central characters is a chap called David Tyson, as I'm sure you know, who was one of the CIA operatives for Team Alpha, the first CIA unit behind enemy lines at the start of the Afghan war in 2001. And not really a warrior type, more a linguist type, an academic. In fact, I think he's now a professor of a US university as we speak. And he obviously became really good friends with Toby, and Toby managed to get, to get really trusted, which is what you need to do when you need to get the accuracy, the details right. And just reading the book, I think that, he goes into an incredible amount of detail about what happened, really pieces it together. I think he uses the term jigsaw. I thought that was a really good metaphor for how he all the different accounts, not all of them correlate, and how he pieced it together like a jigsaw to get an overall picture, which is what we get with First Casualty.
Yeah, and bearing in mind a lot of these memories would have been in combat situations where memory can't always be, well, it just isn't always as reliable as it might ordinarily be.
Yeah, the first plan is always the one that goes when action happens. So you're absolutely right. And memory of what happens is clouded by, what you want to have happened rather than what did happen, and what you may be traumatized by. It's quite a tricky subject, interviewing someone that's been in a traumatic situation, and we're going to be doing it later with some veterans from the Falklands of 40 years ago in your next set of podcasts, Steve.
In our next set of podcasts, in fact, Mike.
Set of podcasts. Yeah.
Yes, we are. We're working with the South Atlantic Medal Association, but more of that later.
Indeed. So anyway, that's his third book. He's done one every 10 years. He's hoping to up that rate now that he's going to concentrate on non-fiction writing. I'd say that actually, based on the one of those three that I've read, that sounds like a very good career, ahead for him. And he's obviously passionate about it, and he's obviously very good at it. So all power to his elbow.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. He probably does need to increase the output rate of one every 10 years. But he's also got a proposal in, which he referred to, I believe. Yeah,
you didn't get a hint of what that might be about.
No. Well, I did, but it wasn't for recording, unfortunately.
Not submarine COs with new cabins or anything like that?
No. So does that mean then that when they've had their your new cabin, that everybody else who moves in after you has to live with your interior design choices?
There are about, I think, 6 or 7 COs, commanding officers of HMS Turbulent, that followed me, that are probably cursing my choice of decor and upholstery and design. But I was there first, so there.
Well, I think you should send them letters of apology at the very least.
Well, we meet up once a year. We call ourselves a band of brothers we meet up with our sponsor, Lady Deborah Cassidy, who launched the submarine back in 1983, although we haven't last year or the year before because of COVID, but we keep in touch, so we're always ribbing each other.
I guess your interior design couldn't be as bad as I'd assumed. But one other point before we go is that Toby's also agreed to do a talk for us as well. So there will be an opportunity in the coming weeks for him to present some more pictures, because there's an awful lot of photos, but also the audience will be able to ask him questions. So if you'd like to find out more about the book or Toby or his career, then watch this space. Yeah,
that's definitely in my diary to listen. Having listened to his interview with you, I think he will be a fascinating talker. I encourage everyone to sign up for that. I think that would be a must hear.
I could not agree more. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you. And is that the last of our current series?
This is the season finale. We're meant to have like a cliffhanger, aren't we, or something?
Well, we've got some stuff in the pipeline, haven't we?
We have. Very exciting. We've already sort of briefly talked about it, but the next sort of series of podcast, 8 episodes, which will be about the Falklands, and hopefully we'll be uncovering some stories that people may not have heard.
Does that mean our long-suffering listeners have got to put up with the two of us for a bit more?
We're not going away. We're just going to keep at it, even if there's only one listener.
You thought you got rid of us, but you were all wrong.
So you need to do your Arnie impression of "I'll be back."
Well, you've just done it for me. I don't think I can top that, to be honest. I'm better at Sean Connery. Personally, I give us 1 charge in 3.
I tried to stop you doing it for the last episode, and you've done it again. Anyway, enough of this. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening. The Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity exists to support sailors, Marines and their families for life. If you or someone you know could do with some support, give them a call on 023 93 87 1568 or drop them an email on support@rnrmc.org.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more, please subscribe.